So one of the points that I think we've talked about specifically is that shift from the quantitative to the qualitative.
Yeah.
And oh wow, let me just kind of I'll put forth a bit of an ontology that I certainly use, and it may be helpful. So the basic ontology at the level of economy consists of three fundamental types. One type I'll just call for the moment the atomic, or the distinct ontological primitives that we could consider to be the most fundamental forms of materiality, and then energy, and then pattern. And pattern has to do with the potentiality into which we can use energy and various processes, transformations to combine the atomic into new forms of atomic, right? So I can then imagine an economy that would have what's effectively a database that contains all of the atomics, including the higher order pattern structures that could be instantiated from others, including all the processes, including the various energetic costs associated with that. And you could have a separate database that actually tracks the real-time presence of instantiated patterns in location, by the way, tagging them with particulars. For example, Indy Johar in this location has this cell phone, for example. And this creates a full accounting of the entire process moving back and forth. Not sure why that came up. Anyway, that's some of the notions. So that notion of energy, atomic, and pattern are ones that I use often.
I think it's a superbly interesting frame to start a conversation with, right? Because I think one of the challenges that we face is we built our thesis of the economy through the thesis of the commodity and the pre-understood, i.e., as you said, as we started this conversation, the quantitative and the qualitative. The
Right.
quantitative is a pre-understood notion. But actually, I would say our economy is not made on commodity and the pre-understood notions, but the discovery of value that hasn't existed. And the discovery of value is what constructs, I think, our theory of, because commodities have very little marginal cost gains. They have marginal value in society. They're about transactional efficiencies. You're really eking out, but actually value in society, shifts, are constructed in that other space. And I think that other space of the kind of non-quantitative, non-predictive, non-commodity economy is, I think, going to become more and more critical and more valuable as our machined economy actually takes the commodity and commoditizes everything else into micropayments. So I think this is a really interesting question about that other economy. We often talk about the word innovation. There's other words that we've associated with it, whether it should sort of other kind of thinkers. But I think there's something interesting about that other space now. And I think the non-commoditative economy, I think, is a really interesting, the qualitative aspects of it. I think the lower order dimensions of it, intangible economies, so non-tangible goods. There's also, and if we're really provocative, our theory of commodity, as I think spoke about recently. I think the theory of commodity is a function of a theory of object-subject. It's a separation theory. You can only have commodity if you separate, and thereby the object has to be born. Thereby, property has to be constructed.
Yeah.
And just to keep playing with it, I think so much of our, we know, for example, white picket fences, right, are a function of slavery. Because only if you had abundant labor with no price value attached to it and no idea would you be able to construct those things. So lawns, picket fences, these are a function of a labor economy, and a particular labor economy. So our aesthetics are rooted in those frameworks, and those aesthetics have carried on manifesting. So brass handles, for example, and silver knives. Brass handles, which you have to clean every day, are a signature effect of an excess labor economy, which you can then show as an ornament in society, and thereby constructs a theory of value in society in a way that didn't exist. So the kind of abundant use. So I think there's something in here, and again, I've not defined it elegantly, but I think there's something in here about how our economy is formed through abundances and aesthetics and effectively signaling of value. And the other point I'd add is that I think one of the things that's become clear is, even Adam Smith made this very clear, is that our market sits in society.
Mm-hmm.
Our market sits in society. The abstraction of the market of social signals actually removes all sorts of care and embedded reciprocal care in a system that allows for unintended externalities. So I think one of the really interesting things is how do you put the social signals back into the market, actually in the social recognition, and the kind of that would mean that actually records and transactions become socially recorded, not just financially recorded, which means that there's accountability in the chain. So there is a kind of interesting functions of our economy have become desocialized systemically and abstracted to the point of information, and the reduction of information is a problem. And I think now we have the capabilities to re-layer those multimodal information systems. So there's lots of different layers of this economy conversation that I think really worth unbundling. So just to put that on the table.
Yeah, that was a lot. That was what do you call it? Abundance. So there are a couple of things that popped out as if I can track them. Let's see. So one, let me see, maybe three. One had to do with the decontextualization move, which is also a narrowing and extending. So, for example, let's just go through for me, the classic study of the commodification of corn. So what we do is we narrow the variety that has economic legibility, which gives us, on the one hand, a lot more of a much narrower stack, which also produces more fragility in like 9 different dimensions. Okay, so that's like all one thing that all comes together.
driven by information systems, which are driving that narrowness. So you actually reduce the information quantity that you have to distribute. So you can say it's this, and it's universally this.
Yes, that's right.
Information that's driven this.
Yes, and then we can flip it around. Right? So we're moving. There's like this a recontextualization move has a whole bunch of different characteristics, which includes, for example, simultaneously the producing a new legibility of qualities and the production of new qualities into that new legibility capacity. So those are both, exactly. That's there. Okay, so that's one. That's very interesting. Okay, then the other one had to do with the let me see if I can figure out how to do this right. All right, so what I was hearing was something funny. It was Downton Abbey, actually. The movement in the Victorian era into the modern era. And of course, the proposition I'm proposing is that we're now in a higher tone version of the same kind of movement, where we have an economic construction that expanded unconsciously, more or less, to play with the particular potentialities that were being selected for in that moment. And what we saw at the late stage of the Victorian era was a circumstance of hypertrophication of, for example, brass handles that had to be polished all the time, which actually was really interestingly bound, because on the one hand, it could only emerge in a context where you actually had a very striated class structure and a very large number of people for polishing handles. And all of the different elements of what that implies, I desire these because it's carried with, it's part of the content of the class that I'm part of. But as you get to the late stages of that, you get to the context where if you don't actually have a transition for those people in the lower class, everybody is conspiring to keep that going, because I'm better off being a butler who's polishing a knob than being totally fucked, right? And we're in that mode, right? We're in the mode right now where we're clearly going to be churning. Like, everybody's more or less aware of the fact that something like 85% of the economy is bullshit jobs. You know, we're at the end of a stage. Almost all of that, everybody would be better off if you could just dispense with it, but we have no place for people to go. And so that piece, right? How do we actually create that? And, you know, it's interesting. It's it's funny. And I think about it, it's a local global optimum problem that we've got a reasonably well-respected, and perhaps in a relatively, Downton Abbey, a pretty honorable household valet who kind of does super meaningless work, but it's still better than what's on the other side of that hill. Now, if we can find a way to get a higher hill that we can get to, I'm in. Right? Let's all do that. But the valley in between, it's a valley crossing problem. So, okay, that was that piece. And then what was the third piece? Bugger. I think I combined two there. I combined part
of the markets conversation.
Yes, the markets
conversation.
And the notion of the Roman emperor, the gold hath no smell. That's the degree to which we actually become enervated to a wide variety of events that were we provided with the sensing of it. Back when I was in law school, a very long time ago, I wrote an essay for a professor in international law. And I just wrote about the implications or the consequences of supply chains beyond a certain distance clip moral and ethical perception. Right? Which is pretty obvious, right? But that's the point. When you live in an economy that has decontextualization and the long enough supply chains, our feedback loops to simply literally live a life that we ourselves would consider to be values driven, like the values that we personally hold, we actually can't. And so we're stuck, and we'll produce proxies. Like we'll try to put a label, like a check, try to find some new proxy to bring information back in. But part of this transition, so it's interesting, like you've got the transition sort of, you can see how it all fits together. One piece is producing a recontextualization, which reactivates our capacity to actually make sure that our values are really being expressed into the world through our various choices, including our economic choices. Reproducing or in that same movement, producing a valorized way of being in the world so that people can migrate from bullshit jobs into actually living meaningful lives. And I mean both living in the sense of surviving, but also meaningful, right? Both simultaneously. And then the technical piece or the information piece, like how do we actually create that new recontextualization so the new qualities and the re-legibility of old qualities is afforded.
And exactly. And I think it opens up some really interesting questions. So I think, the kind of things I've been enamored by is so modernism and universalism had to approximate, say, the value of a particular type of iron. And it would say, this is the value of that iron. This is how strong it will be, and engineers would put a factor fold on it. It would say, we'll give it a 1.5 factor, which means everywhere in the world, if you did this process, you will get to something that can resist this quantum of effects. That universalization, actually with a factor in it, allowed for universal production. It allowed for simple patterns to be replicated around the world. Now, what's interesting is information and qualitative information has become radically richer, which means now we can say to that iron, what is the particular capacity?
Right.
And so our pattern language has become factorfold richer. So we don't have to say to the iron or iron of A type. We can say to that iron, what is the right? Now that means that we're living in an age of pixel craft, which looks like craft, but it still is a higher order pattern. It's not pure craft, but it's pixel craft of an order, which means that we can start to do higher resolution universalism at a more abstract level, which looks and adapts to context at a much richer level. So that's one dimension. I think this information material rebinding. And then what I think the second part of it is when you can rebind that information with higher levels of social signaling, so the craftsman that's involved, the information systems that are involved, and we can create a new form of information wrapping around it. We can then start to rebury the social into the market space and build accountability chains in a way that didn't exist. So this reciprocity, yes. So the rebinding of information and materiality at a higher, richer level means that we can start to construct a planetary localism. A localism which isn't about the proximus of two people, but a localism which is planetary. And I think this starts to take us into the paradigm leap of getting us past our Fermi paradox and our, as we talked about last time, actually our multipolar trap problem. And this information material rebinding is opening up this landscape and thereby, and as you rightly say, The real question then becomes, is in an age when we're going to see 60, 70% of our existing economy, which is fundamentally broken, right? So the fact that a can of Coke is cheaper than an orange, as we discussed last time, is a fundamental failure, because it means that a can of Coke, which is constructing huge externalities, unpriced, self-terminating at the cumulative level externalities relative to the orange, means that we're incentivized, the economy is incentivized to produce pills that harm us versus goods that create value. Now, unless we can recode our theory of risk, and then rebuild information around our materiality and rebuild the social information around our market landscapes, those things become the pathways to a new economy and a whole new theory of value formation. And that, I think, is an extraordinary moment that we're living in. And I think the language of the market is no longer sufficient, because the language of the market is about the abstraction to price, where actually the market as a function of social price, reciprocity, care, is an abandonment of entanglement of relations, which is the reality of the market. The reality of the market that we went to in our local village was not actually without social reciprocity, without accountability, without any of the other social goods attached to it. The price function existed into that social entanglement. But the disentangling of price from that social entanglement has been a fundamental problem. And I think our information age is now rewrapping those things, which I think is an extraordinary moment.
Yes, I want to explore that, but feel like I want to throw another angle into it. I feel like there's something here. So we've talked about a number of different either inversions of meaning or revaluations of certain notions and concepts, and it feels like there's a lot that unlocks. Can you hear that noise in the background? It's okay. So, for example, one of the things that you brought forth was a shift in the understanding of the concept of sustainability. And what I would say, oddly enough, is I'm actually just call it a regrounding, like a recognition of what it actually must always mean, which is to say what it has always meant, and a recontextualization. So instead of holding it as an abstraction and almost in the negative space of the opposite, like trying to create, identifying sustainability as the logical opposite of consumption to non-existence, but rather saying, no, this is actually a more fundamental concept, so we can understand it in its positive sense. And when we do that, we recognize that it's intrinsically generative, right? Exactly. So let's walk me through the logic of that again, so that we can have it out there, and then I feel like we can weave these two points together in an interesting way.
Yeah, there's two things there, and I think I want to go through them. So one, I think it's an anecdotal frame, but let's run with it for a moment. If you go to the Model Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, what you see is, I think, the transition of our economy, where you see the Model T Ford, and as you walk past the different Ford models, they go from being sort of mechanical systems to being social consumables. So even how they're sold, there is, all the paraphernalia you can imagine of the late 1950s, early 1960s. They're sold as a lifestyle consumption, rather than, if you look at the first advertisements, they're technical devices. They're sold as technical devices. Now we know Mr. Ford actually created the thesis in many ways of the abundance of saying, I'm going to pay $5. And the $5 pay meant that actually he could build retention on one side of labor, because he had the highest retention, because he was doing repeated work, humans as robots work. Actually, that was his theory. He had a very low retention rate. So in order to deal with that, he gave $5. $5 meant that he created the consumer economy, where work became effectively humans as robots, a submission of self to the machine. And actually, you filled that gap in the evenings and over the weekends, when the weekend was born, as a social recognition system through the act of consumption. And this production-consumption loop that was born, I think, was the first malformation of the thesis of the market, because the consumption was not a mechanism to distribute innovation and improvement of human life. It was a means to fill the damage done between 9 to 5 of the suppression of the ego,
Yeah.
and thereby consumption became a therapeutic good, a kind of in perpetuity therapeutic good to deal with the harm of the morning day. And that meant that our consumer economy is a mal-consumer economy, not a consumer economy. It's a social fix. This is why everything we buy is actually about endorphins, it's about social recognition, it's fixing the problem of work. But the problem is work, the nature of work. And I think this kind of thesis is really critical. And then, as you rightly pointed out, kind of sustaining what? This is the real question in the heart of sustainability. Sustaining what? Most of the world that we live in is non-viable into the future as we look into it.
Mm.
And so there's a really interesting question of what is it that we're sustaining. And I think and that needs to be asked in that conversation in reference to that production malconsumption landscape that we've got into. And pretty much all the goods that we buy, whether it's salt, whether it's sugar, whether it's clothes, all of these things have become actually mechanisms to temporarily sedate psychologically the damage that is done to us through birth and our familiar structures. So the consumer economy is a deep problem because it's a drug. It's a greater drug epidemic than we've ever had. And I think because in classical economic theory, and you'll know this better than I will, Jordan, like consumption is a means to distribute innovation in society to fulfill the needs and the capacities of all of us. Mm-hmm. It's a distribution mechanism of innovation. And I think we've been distributing drugs.
Well, I think that you made a very specific point, so I just want to put a press down on it because it was a double move and a triple move, very profound, right? So one is we broke people, right? So we took functioning people and we broke them, which is to say we actually created a need for medicalization, in this case, a car or whatever. It doesn't really matter, right? You just fill in the hole. Two, but the way we broke them wasn't arbitrary. We broke them by means of and in furtherance of increasing their ability to produce drugs. And then that loop closes. They can only continue working in the way that they're working as long as they have a continuing supply of drugs. But as long as they continue working the way they're working, they can continue to produce a supply of drugs. We actually produce this weird perpetual motion machine which has a trajectory, and that trajectory is interesting, that it continues to grow as long as the ability to strip mine wholesomeness is available in a multidimensional fashion. But once you've reached the edges of wholesomeness, it collapses catastrophically.
Or how about this? Let's look at this, flip it for a moment. Imagine that we had to be the robots in order to make the data infrastructure for the robots to come in behind us. So this is actually the evolutionary path.
Nice. Yeah.
Right? So we had to become that which we had to shed. And what we're now living in is an age where actually that machine-human function can be reimagined as it's mechanized to release humanity as a whole.
Totally.
And this release is a two-way release, both from the harm of production and also the needs for the consumption in that thesis. And that is an extraordinary leap.
Okay, so let me say what I think I heard. So Viveki and I actually recorded a conversation yesterday talking about that notion of the neocortex. So there's like this really interesting band that's beginning to form around exactly this point. And the example of the calculator was the example we used. So I'll use that to recapitulate what you just said. Right? We had a need in the economy that was emerging for for substantial amounts of algorithmic number crunching to output new numbers, i.e. calculation. And we had an economic role. Right? We actually took humans and we found humans whose brains could be squeezed into this weird form factor where they could spend 8 hours a day crunching numbers with relatively high degree of fidelity and speed. And that enabled a whole economic function to emerge that couldn't survive without that function. Which, by the way, sucked, right? To be a calculator was a really depleting job to have. And then we invented a calculator. And on the one hand, we extinguished that job from the economy. And on the other hand, we had a slot, like it had a raison d'etre, and now it's there. It actually does the job better and cheaper, which expands the economic capacity around that entire role. Of course, calculator that eventually becomes computer. Okay, so let's take a look at that split. So to be a calculator, I mean, as a human playing that role, you're still stuck in that bad choice, right? If I stay where I am, I have the benefit of a job. When I can buy food and I got shit to do. I got something that fills my time during the day. It's not great, but it's better than what is currently the available alternative. The presencing of the calculator has the liberating effect of removing my needing to play that role, or anybody needing to play that role in the economy. But it also has the terrifying but liminal effect of now popping me out of a place that I felt unpleasant, but also stable. So this is like the wrong form of sustainability. You're actually sustaining something that if we could just think more holistically around what's happening, everybody would agree. It's the Moloch problem in a very particular way. Like we're all conspiring to sustain things that we actually all know would be better off not sustained.
And what that means is that we have to actually build the investment mechanisms for the disruption of humans, not just the disruption of technology.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the mechanisms to build the calculator. We don't have the mechanisms to find the new human role in the next space. And the developmental capacity, that's right. I think this is the key thing.
Right.
It's the developmental capacity to discover the next role. And the democratization of that is probably the key pre-distribution model that we could do to drive justice into the world in a great sense. So the greater we can open that up, the greater the pathway to doing that. And this technological human mutual symbiotic disruption actually has to be a co-accelerant rather than a single point accelerant.
Yes. Okay. Let's actually move that into the center because there's a lot that expands on that point. So this is not the most important part, but just as a piece, we're talking about okay. So we have a problem. Our problem is the legacy economy that we are currently sitting in, and I'll ignore the degree to which it produces the material needs that we have. Right, just ignore that. It does it adequately, very poorly across 6 different ways, which I'm focusing on just the human allocation, the way humans' time and energy is spent. The technical disruption is in the process of liberating those roles, and this implies a necessity of producing a developmental capacity for human beings to actually apply that liberated energy in some new way, time and energy. One problem we have, our existing developmental institutions, I say education, are qualitatively inadequate, strictly inadequate, right? They were designed
because they're designed to be the machine.
Yes.
They're designed to make us the machine,
right?
Not designed to actually break the machine.
Right. So let's hammer that in, right? The reason why learn to code is in fact categorically wrong is that the entire arc, like 250 years of educational institutions, the whole category is designed to make us into mediocre machines. And that era, the whole era is what's ending. It's not like we need a new kind of mediocre machine that we can become. We're at the end of that whole story. Okay, neat. That means we have to go one level deeper. What is this actually, this thing? It's producing institutions that develop humans qua human, and then bring these newly developed humans back into the social space in which the economic space happens to be a subsidiary.
And this is the great revolution. People often think it's a technological revolution. Actually, it's not the technological revolution. This is the revolution because it is at this point we deal with our planetary capacities. We deal with actually the multipolar traps.
Right.
We can recast our whole radical landscape of institutions. Everyone is focusing on environmental tech, climate tech, but actually it's human development tech. The redevelopment of human beings is actually the number one disruption.
Right. So let me kind of enumerate some of the elements of what happens, why that's the case. So one, human beings that are reconnected to wholeness and meaningfulness radically reduce the number of drugs, which is to say consumer products that they want or need. So we're talking about, and I mean radically, like 85%, just maybe more, right? Now, on the one hand, this is a collapse of the consumer economy, but on the other hand, this is a radical reduction of bullshit that we don't need. Okay, we got to figure out how to make it's like the the classic Indiana Jones move where you got to figure out how to get the idol off the platform. We got to make that move, and there's a bunch of moving pieces. We have to figure out how to make that shift happen. But that one piece is enormous, right? The amount of waste, right? All of Coke, like literally a human being who is just living a wholesome, meaningful life. I don't want any more Coke. So we just eliminate Coke as a category. Now, of course, to the degree to which we can also provide high quality, context rich information of what will actually provide you with higher quality well-being and price it appropriately. So it's actually cheaper in a real way. Now you get a feedback loop where they're like, okay, yes, that makes sense. I'm happy with my cost of Coke going way up because on the one hand, I no longer need to have a drug. And on the other hand, I'm increasingly able to be aware of why I would want wholesome things to actually be the choices that I make.
And also you can talk about hyper-nutritious environments. So it's not we can talk about hyper-nutritious, and I use the word hyper to give it a 10 or 15 or 100x qualitative. What does an orange look like of that nature? What does a mushroom look like of that nature? What does a bread look like when it's of that nature? What does air smell like when it's of that nature? What does a microbiome environment look like when it's that nature? So this is not an anti-tech, an anti-production economy. It's a new production economy,
Very nice.
which isn't driven through a dopamine effect model because we don't need it. We are turning it into a symbiotic accelerator for a new human development model.
Right. Yeah. So just to maybe put it again, to sort of recapitulate that, if I can actually have a way of being aware, and I mean this in the informational sense, of a farmer who is producing food in a fashion that is simultaneously regenerating the quality of the soil, regenerating, like actually removing heavy metals and toxins and pesticides, rejuvenating the insect and animal biome, beautifying the physical landscape, and synergistically producing multiple different outputs. And let's just isolate one, the food, which happens to have complex multi-nutrients that regenerate our gut biome and provide a 10x increase in psychological and physical health. Right? If I had the ability to actually know that was the case, then that particular kind of activity would have that legibility, and individuals who are oriented in that direction would be able to be supported to continually develop their vocation. And as you say, hyper, right? We're talking about 2 orders of magnitude or more increase in the qualitative richness of the world that we are creating with each other.
And in a boring sense, and a kind of boring revolution sense, this is all an accounting problem.
In many ways, it's all an accounting problem.
It's actually rooted in how we account and what we don't account. We don't account for the destruction of soil. We don't account for the externalities in terms of your health. We don't account. So actually, it's an accounting system which is malforming our production economy, our real estate economy, our infrastructure economy at a systemic level, and also then misdeploying capital, because we know this capital is then driving self-termination, to use your language, at a societal scale. So this is it's foreshortening our capital sort of futures in a really radical way. So I do think this is a wrapper problem. It's a code problem. It's how we're coding our society. And actually, this is not an anti-technology. It's not an anti-production economy. It's a pro-production, pro-consumer economy, but not a mal-consumer economy.
Oh gosh. Okay. There's 2 things. So one is, if I think about it in terms of the notion of technology, oh God, it's weird how the synergy value works here. It's actually a much harder thing to do, which is to say that it creates a higher degree of, how do I say this right? It's a better job to have. That's the best way of putting it. As a person who's producing these kinds of technologies, I actually begin to move in the direction of being a master craftsman, not a turner of cranks, and because I'm doing profound design challenges that, when solved, are elegant.
And it's because I think we talk about a different form of intelligence, which is a full embodied intelligence. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-sensorial, multi-cognitive intelligence. It's a full embodied intelligence as opposed to an abstracted intelligence model. And that means that we operate from a mass multi-beneficiary effect, able to construct multiple dimensions of empathy and logics. Now, our information landscape is now able to assist and support that. That is an extraordinary moment. And I think for me, and this would change our theory of machines as well, from being abstracted intelligence to fully embodied intelligence systems. And it changes how we work with that model. So I think there's something really critical about the word craft that you use, because craft is a multidimensional didactic discovery model. It's a discovery in context. It's an embodied discovery in context. And it's multidimensional because actually you take in all sorts of embodied senses to be able to do that. That is actually a full sense of being human. And why it's not commodity is because you have to continuously discover that. You're continuously optimizing, and you're continuously, this was text messages we talked about, you continuously dynamically constructing a new stability. You're dynamically constructing new stabilities into that system, which I think is beautiful words in that way.
So, yeah, so my mind began to drift. I was thinking about all. Okay, so let me take another problem that is rather acute, actually. They're very, very linked. So one problem is the problem of psychological distress. Teenage girls experiencing, suicidal thoughts or anxiety across the board. Right? So we have psychological distress, or what looks to, in fact, actually be an exponential increase in SSRI prescription. So fill in the blank. Right? The medication piece, medication everywhere because of destabilization of actual holistic life and demographic collapse. Right?
Yes.
Both problems are solved in this category. In fact, this is the only actual way of solving the problem. And it's weird. It's actually, in a certain way, it's very simple. If you want to solve these problems, just rehumanize. Healthy humans living in a healthy world that is beautiful and nurturing mate. And they intrinsically will mate, because that's where the deeper sense of actual meaningfulness comes, is when you have the context to support that, then having a partner that you live complex, challenging life with and really expand, go develop the level of intimacy and understanding of each other so you can really, really deeply, deeply understand another human, and then produce yet another human together, which is now an even bigger possibility. Like, this is what happens when people are oriented towards the capacity to live meaningfully and rediscover what meaningfulness is. They'll do that. And these people will actually radically not have challenges with high anxiety problems. Their bodies won't be experiencing toxic and non-nutritious food. Their minds will not be experiencing toxic environments, and therefore their healthy bodies and healthy minds will feel healthy, which is, that's what I say. It's like when people say they have, catastrophic or spiraling anxiety, that's because our bodies and minds know that we don't live in a healthy world. Give us a healthy world and that will go away.
And that's the key word, right? These are not our anxieties. Our anxieties are a function of the system and the context that we've created. And that is a machine that is constructing systemic harm to us. And we're in a symbiotic, self-destructive loop right now, both that we're being human. And you're absolutely right. We are often focusing on the climate crisis from an external lens of actually looking at the climate. But the climate crisis is a function of a dehumanized crisis, a crisis of dehumanization.
So that was the other one thing I wanted to bring up. So let me pop this out.
Yeah.
I was recently watching a video, I think, but the meme is strong. So I'll put it this way. I personally, simultaneously, am keenly interested in this notion of 15-minute town, not 15-minute city, 15-minute town, walkable, right? Human scale, beautiful, alive. Like, I'm keenly interested, so much so that I've uprooted my family and moved to a place that fits those characteristics. And I am strenuously opposed to Davos and the World Economic Forum governing that process, right? Those are not in the least bit mutually contradictory. Those are actually, there are many, many things that the world actually wants and needs. Like, we actually do want to have a robust accounting system that understands all the different externalities of all of our economic functions, that allows us to then be informed and supported to be able to make choices that are in alignment with our values, so that we know what our choices, the consequences our choices have. And I don't trust deeply centralized bureaucracies with highly misaligned incentives to be the ones that design and control those, right? This is not a contradiction. And I think it's important politically for people to be aware of that. Like, we can't fight the things we actually need because the guys we don't like are promoting a simulacrum of them. We have to be able to separate the simulacrum from the real thing, and then produce the governance mechanisms that are necessary for the real thing, and then do the real thing and extinguish the simulacrum.
And I think the word simulacrum is really important here. I think the problem is there is no 15-minute city. Okay, I'm going to be completely controversial.
It is.
Yes, you could talk about a 15-minute city in terms of you can get what you want in 15 minutes, but that isn't your city. Your city is the water landscape, your energy landscape, your material landscape, your weather flow that comes in. I think we're reducing humans to a small space rather than expanding humans to our planetary entanglements.
Wow.
And I think it's just one dimension of being human, not the dimension of being human. This is my problem with it, is that actually we live in informationally, you and I, in this sense, are as close as probably your neighbor, right? In the conversations that we have. So actually, in an informational sense, we're living in a 15-minute world or a 1-hour world, right? So I just find the reductiveness, the simulacrum language that we package things into, actually reduces our humanity to see the entanglements. We are so much more. And the reduction of us is actually a problem, because I think the reduction of us to a 15-minute idea actually destroys the landscape for you and I, destroys the landscape of the birds that fly half a continent to be with us. I think we're so much more.
Oh, this is so nice. So this connects, I think, with what you and I talked about last time. So the problem is something like the technocracy can only give us the simulacrum. It can only give us the 15-minute city. And it gets in the way, because what we actually need is a new form of governance that has the capacity to perceive this high dimensional, super rich field of all the different particulars, and that can produce that, right? So it simultaneously produces the baker who lives right there and is a local piece of energy where all the individuals in my neighborhood walk there and we chat and we connect in a very human way, and can create a mechanism whereby I actually have the highest quality possible conversation with the 2 or 3 best collaborators, literally from the human species, right, in the same day. Now that's the kind of thing we actually want to produce. Also, as you say, and where the water that's flowing by is clean. Yeah, and we could go on, right? That's what we actually want, and the machine that we've got can't produce that, right? The technocracy is, again, strictly incapable. Just like our educational system was designed to produce mediocre machines, our technocracy was designed to produce and to use mediocre machines. Fine, new design problem. Let's do that.
Exactly, and this is why I totally understand where the 15-minute city is coming from. I understand it, but I think in its words, in the packaging, in the comprehension of it, in the resolution factor that it finds, it's fundamentally problematic, because it resolves the wrong problem and actually then creates a whole new classes of problems, which will be, and this is my deep worry, that we start to imagine, I do live in a 15-minute city. Well, then you live in a different 15-minute city. What is that? It's not real. These aren't real because they fundamentally undermine and misestimate our quantum of entanglements, and thereby lock us in to a competitive theory when we're actually reaching a moment where that competitive theory will lead us to war, as Danny and other people eloquently put up.
Yeah,
so the logic, the resolution problem is actually not just softly problematic, not like just I have a little bit of a problem with it. I think it's systemically problematic. I understand the values to which it wants to drive.
That's right.
But but the political effects of that simulacrum, the political economy that it will generate, is going to be deeply disruptive.
Yes.
And this is where the problem lies.
Yeah, I'm with you. So we probably need a stronger word than problematic, right? Problematic has become problematic. Yeah. We need a stronger word. Fucked is nice. So you went to the direction of war, and let's get down there, because that's kind of where we are. Like, that seems to be the challenge. And here I'm actually thinking about it from the interior, right? So the fact that when the governance mechanisms that we have simply can't produce what we actually need, and what they produce is a simulacrum of what we actually need, but are very deeply incapable of changing, right? So there's a resistance. What we end up getting is the kind of conflict that we're beginning to see at the various levels of local politics. You have a polity, or humans, who are poor humans, right? Working bullshit jobs, drugged to the gills in every direction, and having a deep, in many ways, proper sense of powerlessness. Not completely proper, but in many ways proper, right? All the channels that they believe are the valid channels don't work, and in fact couldn't work if they tried. And so the size of the challenge is a step function bigger than almost anybody is prepared to be able to surmount. And so what do? They're either going to, if they have a lot of native energy, they get very angry, and their anger is a non-directed desire to create change, but no will of dealing it. Or they go the opposite direction, and they get depressed, and they sort of begin to move into different forms of increase the medicalization of self. And this happens at the different levels of scale, right? So you'll get states in conflict, and you get nation states in conflict, and all that sort of thing. And so the challenge is something like, how do we hospice the global technocracy? How do we begin to change the resource allocation function, which is a conversation you and I have had quite a few times, so that those who are prepared to begin the process of building the capacity for us to get above this step function have the resources to be able to onboard more and more people into that collaborative work, so that we in fact can get over that step function, and then bring the whole of humanity and the nature and technology across that threshold. It feels like that is the point, right? When we're not going to do it by trying to get our local parliamentarians to do something which is just not built into their system, not built into their psychology. Where's that spot?
I think this is a really important conversation at multiple levels. So one level is, what if we frame the moment as trying to find the great peace? Because I think you're right to say we have been living in war, just a different type of war. Not just a physical war between nation states. We've been living in informational subversion wars. We've been living in malnutrition wars. We've been living in all the kind of our industrial complex has been at war with being human. This has been a systematic attrition. And I think discovering a new peace, and that war is now becoming self-terminating. So the micro-violences that we've erupted, in terms of species destruction around the world, the greatest moment, one of the great extinction level events, have been happening over the last 50 years in our lives. So we've been living in a war. It's just the war is invisible, non-visible. If you look at the amount of cattle in the world, they're factorfold larger than any wild animals in the world. Just cattle. Factorfold, not like a little bit more, like factors of fold larger. So actually the planet, we have been at war fundamentally with every other life system in the planet, and have actually totally largely consumed it in many ways. So I think the question about the great peace is, I think, a really interesting question. because it starts to reframe the present into a new language. I do think the great peace is a developmental problem. The great peace is a de-addiction problem. The great peace is a demedication. I don't mean just drugs, but actually the great peace it's an extraordinary human development question. And I think it's completely under-considered in a lot of the environmental transition movements, this part of the story. Because I think we keep looking to save the planet, but actually, I think the only way to save the planet is to save being human.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the great quantum leap.
Quite interesting earlier, almost like to fulfill being human. Yeah. There's something about this journey we've been on that has a purpose to it. There's something. This wasn't just an error. There was something about this that was going on that has a fulfillment at this moment.
And I think this is a quantum problem, though, at another scale, right? So, is it the fulfillment of being human, or is it the fulfillment of a planet becoming conscious? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's a sort of outwardly problem, because you suddenly have to realize that maybe we are part of a planet becoming self-aware, and we'll be creating the machine-human ecological systems for a planetary consciousness. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? And that might be quite extraordinary in the universe, for a planet to become conscious, right? To be able to create all those conditions to become that. So I think there's also a new thesis and I think the big challenge that we face, and this is, we talked about, right? The American Constitution, the American project, was born at the same time virtually as the Newtonian Enlightenment, Cartesian logics. It was born rooted in an age, rooted in an idea, and a scientific idea. And now the question is, as the object-oriented worldview starts to become entangled, the rebirth of the American project is actually one of the big challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think and the boldness of actually saying what is the new American project lies so deep into reimagining that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the real challenge. And for a kind of a new awakening, a new pathway, it lies in that problem, because the next America lives in a planetary consciousness.
Well, okay, so this is interesting. It's funny. I've made it a habit of listening to podcasts when I'm at the gym, so it gets really nice synergistic. I've noticed actually at least a third level, which is the physiological consequences of actually lifting weights, changes my psychology when I'm relating to the content of the podcast. So maybe about a week ago, I happened to see Jordan Peterson's announcement on Joe Rogan, whatever it is he's planning on doing in sort of fall in London. And when I was watching that, I watched it very closely and I was listening to what he had to say. And I actually had two very distinct responses. One was, finally, like that's actually in the right zone of the kind of thing we need to be doing, or it's more or less what you just said. Yeah. Although being a Canadian, he can't speak about it in the American sense, but nonetheless, he's thinking about it in terms of Western civilization, which is the same exact idea. And the other reaction I had was, and I don't think they're going to have the right, what they need to pull it off. Right? There's something, I sense like something missing. But it feels like we could, right? That's the point. Like if there was just enough complete, the right people coming into that inquiry with that level of, this is what we're doing. We're doing a refounding exercise. Like we're really thinking about this deeply. And there's a continuity, like we're actually thinking about a lineage, but this is a rebirth, right? And this is a lineage that has rebirth built into its infrastructure. So that's not a problem. We just need to be doing it for real. And we're really clear, like we don't know. The whole point is we can't know exactly what this requires, because if everything we're doing is going to be having blind spots depending on exactly what kind of trauma and weirdness we brought into this gig, which is plenty. So we need to be eyes open, ears open, very capable of listening to the things that are coming at us from different directions and bring the right kind of voices into a conversation. And by the way, the right kind of technologies of conversation, right? Even just I don't know if we've talked about this, but God, what was it? There was this thing that happened a couple of years ago, IDW, right? The Internet Dark Web. And one of the things they did is they had debates, right? They sort of brought the notion of debate, sort of in some sense, back. And as I watched it, I was like, well, okay, fine. I mean, maybe that's a thing we need to do. But debate's not the right psychotechnology to get us where we need to get to. It's, again, categorically wrong. Vervaeke brought back in the notion of dialogos, which is not dialogue, right? It's a different kind of thing. And now in the space of dialogos, we're beginning to have enough capacity to collaborate on producing the right kind of psychotechnologies so that we can do this thing, right? So it's a combination of the set of psychotechnologies, the set of instantiations like venues or gatherings or something like that, spaces, and then the right people in the right order, right? Something like that. But like my heart tells me that we're getting close.
I agree, and I have infinite hope actually in that sense. I think there's an inevitability about this problem. We talked about this, right? There are only really two solutions. Either we self-terminate ourselves or we make this transition.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a difficult problem at the end of the day. It's like there really isn't that much choice on the route. Self-termination or you find a way through. And I think it's literally that simple, unfortunately or fortunately. I don't think that this is almost becoming binary, because any persistence of the current modality self-terminates us, almost certainly, either directly or indirectly, either through war or through climate change, or through bioterrorism or any other form
On the blank, yeah, or even like the with a whimper, which we just sort of fail to mate, and we have a demographic collapse that breaks the infrastructure of our economy and creates a positive feedback loop to just evaporation. Like all paths lead to the same end.
Exactly, and I think the kind of realization, the only realization we've got to get to is all paths lead there. And the only path that goes the other way is along the path that we're discussing, because that's a path that actually allows us to open up a new landscape of being human.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can do that, we transform our relationship with the planet, we transform our relationship with things, we transform our relationship with ourselves and everything around us. And this is the deep revolution, the human revolution. Without it, we don't make it through.
Okay.
It's at the root cause. And,
yes.
and as you rightly say, it's a sort of a comprehension of self problem, how we understand ourselves. We've, how we understand the spaces of dialogue. Because I was having a talk about someone was talking about the public. And I said, what's the public? Because I find the public a really problematic term. It was like, the public is an emergent function, right? It's not a thing, it's an emergent function. Because there is no public, because actually the constituent actors of the public are continuously evolving in itself. So if you see the public as an emergent function, the only thing you can do is create the agora, create the landscape, the social technologies for the emergent function of the public. Now, that means that actually we have to start to think about the construction of the public, or the spaces for the public formation, in really radical ways. And that is the size of conversational landscape. Conversation human to human, human non-human, human present and future humans, present and past humans. And it is in that sort of new social technologies or social psychic technologies or psychological technologies that we can construct this other landscape. And that is critical, because that is about building not just the dialogue, but the frameworks of empathy, frameworks of recomprehension that allow us to create these wider senses of public and wider forms of beings, the gods that we talked about some time ago, the emergent gods.
So I'm wondering, well, I guess there's a couple possibilities here. We can either say it's been a very good conversation. Okay, we've done some work. It's been good work. There's one or two more branches that feel alive to me, so we can maybe pursue that. Yeah, so let me put two different branches out that feel alive to me right now. One has to do with this exploration of the resource allocation function, and in particular, something along the lines of like the new universities or the new monasteries, or to put it another way, unfucking philanthropy. And then the other branch was actually double clicking on what you were just saying. And so going deeper into that particular exploration. I think both are quite alive. So,
I mean, let's go with the first one, because I do think what you said there is really important. That I like the fact that you introduced the word monastery, because I think our thesis of human development as an embodied agent, as an embodied being or becoming, not even being, maybe becoming, is really critical, and creating the conditions and the environments for that embodied becoming is actually really critical. And our universities and our education system is not that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't even have the sort of environment for that. Air pollution takes out years of a child's education. Noise pollution means that actually people don't sleep well, so don't have the cognitive capacity. Our food is actually, in nutrition terms, virtually dead. So actually, when you start to look at systemically, we've been eroding our capacity and capabilities as being human. And then if we operate in a landscape of violence, because actually we have been tyrannized in our workplace, and we bring that tyranny back into our household space, our space of home and hearth, and that tyranny, that violence is permeating through it, and that violence has become us. So systematically, every part of our landscape has become auto-destructive to that human development model.
Yeah.
And that requires a radical new educational investment. So the first program for transition, I think, has to be a new human development investment program. So that is one of the great contributions that can be put down. And it doesn't have to be centralized. This is the other thing. And it has to be a distributed modality. And I think in history we've done this. So Thomas Bjorkman and the Nordic Secret, for example, where he talks about how in the Scandics, they turned around and built these Volk schools, which were 50% philosophy and 50% technique, learning through craft and 50% philosophy, where people spent 6 months exploring this a self-authoring capacity. I really like this idea of self-authoring, because to author one's own life, to re-embody your own agency, to build that capacity becomes really critical. And in history, we've done that. And currently our lives are authored by other people's. And we live the lives of other people's authorage. And I think there's something really critical in that human development function as a key part of it. And like we talked about, I just want to keep reinforcing it. This is not an anti-tech story. Fundamentally, I'm saying, let's make the fucking orange 100 times better for being human. Mm-hmm. I'm saying, let's make the air 1,000 times better. I'm actually saying, let's bring technology to bear to actually expanding our sense of being human. Let's bring technology to bear, not as a thesis of control, but a thesis of ennoblement, of ennobling us as humans in a way that we've never done before.
Right.
And I think this is so it's not an anti-technology story. It's a fundamentally new symbiotic story, which is not self-termination. Our current reality with technology is a self-terminating, mutually terminating future, almost certainly, both of technology and us.
It's a very weird thing. I remember I was having a conversation recently with someone, maybe it was somebody who'd been influenced by Buddhism. And I said, from my perspective, in my experience of life, suffering is not a problem. Meaningless suffering is a problem. Okay, technology is not a problem. Meaningless technology is a problem. Like, what we're trying to do is rediscover what meaningful technology would look like, and then have that be what we do. And what we currently have is an anti-meaning technology. We have a technology that exists on the premise, like we said, that consumerist piece, right? The consumerist move, technology is deployed to break us and then fill the gaps that have been made in the process of breaking. So it's an anti-meaning, it's a nihilistic technology. Great, we don't want that. But that doesn't mean technology. That means nihilistic technology. None of that. Meaningful technology, more of that, which is a meaningful vocation for the people who are producing it. Like it's all, but how do you, so the Nordic secret, right? If you have a functional governance, the ability of that functional governance to orient resources to constructing these, what do they call it, gymnasium or something like that? Like a sanitarium, some sort of concept like that, with a new thesis, right? A prophetic sensibility of what's a new possibility for human development that creates more infrastructure for the people. You can do that. When you have a radically dysfunctional governance, you've got a problem. So how do we nip that in the bud? This is turning back to the medieval. I'll get back to the medieval in a second, but please go ahead.
No, I was going to just pick it up. I think when we talk about dysfunctional, I think we've been locked into a tyranny of control.
Nice.
We replaced the theory of kings with the new architectures of control, and our technology became a new means of control, and the mechanisms of control and extraction. So our technologies are extractive control mechanisms as opposed to ennoblement mechanisms, and they've been designed by the forces that be and the masters of those forces that be. And I think this is where the radical democracy has to be reinvented. Democracy is not just the fucking vote. Democracy is the democratization of agency, the creation of radical liberty, the radical freedom, which is not the freedom that exists outside your work and you live in the tyranny of 9 to 5, just a sort of a tyranny a few hours before you go to sleep democracy, but a democracy of the whole. And I think this is, a question of control, technologies of control versus technologies of ennoblement. And ennoblement technologies are fundamentally rooted in a deep democracy and deep unfurling of freedoms because they're oriented differently. I think we're living in the last stage of kings. The last stage of kings. We're still living in the residue, the shadow of kings. And technology is just a shadow designed for those means of control of kings and queens. And I think this is the great revolution that we're in the midst of. And I think that revolution is really critical to build on what you were saying, because I think it is not the technology that's a problem. It is the fact that we live in technology of control. And I think our government is a technology of control. And this is, I think, the next part of the problem. Government is a technology of control.
All right, nice. So what I heard you just do is you just articulated the Declaration of Independence for the contemporary refounding. You've made a very profound articulation just then. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary, when we recognize that our governance are technologies of control, we are in need of a radical liberation. It's going to be a sophisticated one, right? It's going to be a subtle and nuanced one. This is more about like figuring out how to get out of a Chinese finger trap than it is about breaking the chains that bind us. Nonetheless, it is a radical liberation that we're talking about. Okay, fair enough. I think this is what you're saying is correct. And let me sort of reiterate something that I think is beautifully put and we can hold. So, and I think this is quite right. You said the shadow of kings. And the image, like we have a throne, there's nobody sitting in it, but the shadow of the king is still sitting in it. We still have a throne, we still have a crown sitting next to it. We all kind of like look at it. When we look at the American Revolution, and from which all other revolutions point from that point, were kind of echoes in time. The concept of liberty, as articulated, right, is a negative concept, right? It implicitly assumes tyranny, from which it is a resistance. It's
beyond beautiful. Beyond beautiful what you said there. Yeah. This is really critical, because if you only create an opposition, then you're enthralled by what you're opposing, not the generation of what you're creating.
Exactly. And you will inevitably bring that shadow back in. Can't avoid it.
Exactly. It's non-avoidable.
Yeah. So here we are. And I'll say it even more pointedly. The concept of sovereignty, I actually said this to Johnny V yesterday. I heretofore, I claim the word sovereignty. I believe it has been left unused inappropriately, and I'm claiming squatters' rights on unused property, sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign nation state, the sovereign state, from my point of view, is completely incoherent. It is a meaningless concept. It is a derivative of the same kind of move as negative liberty. Right? We made a move. We attached the notion of sovereign to the king. We then killed the king, and we tried to attach the crown to whatever mechanism that we attached it to. But we actually have never once even truly grasped the meaning of the sense of sovereignty. And now we have this bizarre function at the very end of this journey where we have these individuals who are themselves machines produced by markets, producing markets of consumer feedback loops, self-medicating, separate, and put a crown on them and call them sovereign individuals. And that's the furthest from the point, right? I flip it upside down. And this is the developmental question. And I would say that the notion of sovereignty has to do with the capacity to actually make proper choices in relationship with the real lived context that you find yourself in moment to moment. It is to say how to live properly and well. It is coordinated with the concepts of virtue. It is, by the way, deeply connected with the concepts of religion, right? The directionality of sovereignty is an ennoblement directionality. And we revivify, a revitalization of terms like noble, right? Noble is not an inherited formal concept. Noble is an element of character that one becomes ennobled and one then expresses nobility out in the world, and others see that and become in themselves have a higher capacity to become ennobled, right? So it's that level of liberty. That's what we're talking about, a new liberation.
Exactly, and that is completely in contrast to a theory of control where you assume everyone is a bad robot, to which you have to control more viscerally in order to prevent an idea of harm that is constructed by that which controls or optimizes that which controls. And this is a paradigm break moment. That is why we can walk out of the shadow of kings, because in that, and it is a necessary function, because only in the act of ennoblement can we actually construct a new thesis of freedom, and only in an act of freedom not to escape the tyrannies, but a freedom to be and care in the world, can we construct the psychological landscape to actually operate in a class of planetary civics and planetary entanglements. Without that, we live in a landscape of war and tyranny and almost certain actual competitive collaborative demise. It is that clear.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, I feel like we did the thing we needed to do today.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
All right. Till next time.
Okay, my friend. Till next time. Bye. Bye.